moment I saw my brother-in-law whispering into his phone in the corner of my father's hospital room while my dad was still unconscious from surgery, I knew something was very wrong. He didn't see me standing in the doorway. I caught maybe 4 words before he noticed me and hung up. Already contacted the lawyer. I told myself I was being paranoid. My father had just had a major cardiac event. Everyone was stressed. People make strange phone calls in waiting rooms. I smoothed my coat, walked in, kissed my dad on the forehead, and said nothing. That was the first mistake. My name is not important to this story. What's important is that I am the younger of 2 daughters, 31 years old, a high school counselor in Kitchener, Ontario. I drive a used Subaru. I rent a 2-bedroom apartment with my cat, Gerald, and I have never once in my life asked my parents for money. My older sister, Philippa, is 41. She married well, her words not mine, and has spent the last decade reminding everyone in our family of that fact at every possible opportunity. Philippa and her husband, Rowan, live in a house in Oakville that they purchased with their own hard work, which is technically true if you don't count the $80,000 my parents gave them for the down payment in 2016. My parents never asked for it back. They never mentioned it again. That's the kind of people they are. My father built a small commercial refrigeration supply business over 30 years. Nothing glamorous. He drove a truck himself until he was 52. My mother kept the books from their kitchen table. By the time I was in university, the business was stable enough that they could take a vacation once a year and sleep without worrying. They were proud of that in a quiet, private way that I have always loved about them. When my dad had his heart attack in November, I drove 4 hours from Kitchener to Sudbury in the middle of the night. Philippa arrived the next afternoon. Rowan came 2 days later. Dad spent 8 days in the hospital. During those 8 days, I watched Rowan make at least a dozen phone calls he didn't want me to hear. I watched Philippa have long, hushed conversations with my mother in the hallway that stopped whenever I came around the corner. I told myself it was about the business. Dad would need to step back. There were practical decisions to make. Of course they were talking. I told myself a lot of things that week. Dad came home in early December and seemed okay. Tired, but okay. He started cardiac in January. I drove up every other weekend to have lunch with him, watch the Leafs lose, argue about whether Tim Hortons had declined in quality. Normal things, good things. It was during one of those lunches in February that he told me about the will. He said it the same way he would tell me the price of copper fittings had gone up, matter-of-factly, because he thought I already knew. He said he had updated his will a few years back when he and Mom had revised their retirement plan with their financial planner. He said the business would go to me, along with the house, because Philippa had already received her share through the down payment and some other gifts over the years, and because, and this is the part he said very carefully, he believed I would keep the business going and look after your mother. I sat with that for a moment. Does Philippa know? I asked. He looked at his coffee. Your mother and I spoke to her about it. A while ago. I didn't ask anything else. Something in his expression told me the conversation had not gone well. 3 weeks later, Philippa called me. I want to be accurate about this call because I have thought about it many times since. She didn't yell. She was very calm. She said she had been doing some thinking and she believed that Dad had made his decision about the will while he was not at his best. Her words, meaning around the time of his cardiac episode, or perhaps before, when he had been under stress. She said she had spoken to a lawyer. She said she thought it would be worth having Dad assessed by a physician to confirm he had been of sound mind when he made these decisions. I said, Philippa, Dad updated his will years before his heart attack. She said, that's what he says. The line went quiet for a moment. Are you suggesting he's lying? I asked. She said she wasn't suggesting anything. She was just being thorough. After we hung up, I sat on my kitchen floor with Gerald on my lap and stared at the wall for a long time. Within a month, things escalated in ways I couldn't have predicted. Philippa began calling relatives. Our aunt in Hamilton, our cousin who lived outside Calgary, an uncle on my dad's side who we saw maybe once a year at Christmas. I know this because they started calling me, carefully, gently, in the way that people do when they've been told something alarming and want to give you a chance to explain yourself. My aunt asked me, very delicately, whether Dad had ever seemed confused to me lately. My cousin asked if I had been helping with the business finances. I told them the truth, which is that I had nothing to do with the business finances. I was a school counselor. I barely understood my own RRSP. Then, in March, I found out about the Investigator. It came from the most unlikely source, our dad's longtime office manager, a woman named Colette who had worked for my father for 19 years and considered him something close to family. Colette called me on a Tuesday evening and said, in her very direct way, that a man had come by the office asking questions. Not a CRA auditor. She knew what those looked like. This man had asked about my involvement with the business, whether I'd ever accessed the financial systems, whether my name appeared on any accounts. He showed me a card, Colette said. Private investigator, licensed, all of that. I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him you never had anything to do with the accounts, she said, because you haven't, and then I called you. Philippa had hired someone to investigate me, to build a case that I had somehow manipulated my father or interfered with the business, some kind of justification to contest the will, or at minimum to drag the whole thing into a legal dispute that would cost everyone years and money. I want to tell you that I handled this gracefully. I didn't. I called my sister and I was not calm, and she said, very coolly, that she had every right to protect her interests, and that if I had nothing to hide, I had nothing to worry about. Then she hung up. I sat with that for about 48 hours before something shifted in me. Not anger exactly. Something more like clarity. If she was going to investigate me, I was going to know exactly what that investigation found. I called a lawyer, a real one, not my sister's, a woman named Abimbola Okwu who specialized in estate litigation and had been recommended to me by a colleague. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she said 2 things. First, do not touch anything related to the business finances. Not one email, not one spreadsheet, not one phone call with the supplier, because anything I did now could be used to suggest involvement. Second, she would make some inquiries. What Miss Okwu found when she began making those inquiries was not what either of us expected. Over the previous 2 years, the business had been paying invoices to a company called Brightshore Commercial Solutions. On paper, Brightshore was a consulting firm providing supply chain advisory services. In practice, and Ms. Okwu was very careful about how she phrased this when she first told me, in practice, Brightshore did not appear to have any operations, employees, or verifiable clients besides my father's business. Brightshore was incorporated in Ontario in 2021. The registered director was not a name anyone in my family recognized. But the mailing address associated with the company's initial filings was a mailbox at a UPS store in Oakville. Rowan and Philippa lived in Oakville. I remember sitting in Ms. Okwu's office when she showed me this. I remember the particular quality of the silence in that room. I remember thinking about all the phone calls Rowan had made in the corner of my father's hospital room. I did not tell my parents right away. Miss Okwu advised against it while she continued to gather documentation. My father was in cardiac rehab. My mother was already strained. I agreed, even though not telling them felt like its own kind of deception. The investigator Philippa had hired, his name, I later learned, was Derek Haines, licensed and apparently reputable, had come back to Philippa with his findings, which were, as Colette had correctly told him, that I had no involvement in the business finances whatsoever. I had never had signing authority. My name was not on any accounts. There was no evidence of any kind that I had influenced my father's decisions or accessed anything I shouldn't have. I know this because Derek Haines contacted Ms. Okwu directly. He told her that in the course of his investigation into me, he had accessed certain financial records related to the business, records that were legitimately within scope of his retainer, and he had seen things that he could not in good conscience ignore. He had already filed a report. He said, we should know. I have thought about Derek Haines many times since all of this happened. I hope he sleeps well. The following weeks were the strangest of my life. On the outside, nothing had changed. I drove to Sudbury on weekends. My dad and I watched hockey. I brought my mom the rosemary focaccia from the bakery near my apartment because she can't find anything like it in Sudbury. Normal things. Underneath, Miss Okwu was working with a forensic accountant. The invoices to Bright Shore Commercial Solutions totaled just over $190,000 over 22 months. The payments had been approved through a secondary approval process, one my father had set up years earlier to allow certain operational expenses to be processed without requiring his signature every time, a practical measure that had worked fine for a decade. Someone had learned exactly how that process worked and exactly what its limits were. I don't know when Rowan had learned those details. I don't know if Philippa knew. That is the honest truth, and I want to be careful about what I say here because I don't know everything. What I know is what was documented. In April, Miss Okwu told me that the matter had been referred to the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit. I had not made that referral. Derek Haines had, and separately, the forensic accountant's findings had been passed to the relevant authorities. The investigation was no longer mine to manage. My parents found out on a Thursday evening. Miss Okwu and I drove up together. We sat at my parents' kitchen table where my mother had kept the books for 30 years, and Miss Okwu explained what had been found. My father didn't say anything for a very long time. My mother cried, but quietly, the way she does when she's actually devastated rather than just upset. My father looked at me at one point and said, "You didn't tell me." "No," I said. "I didn't want to, not until we knew." He nodded. That was all. Philippa was called by the police on a Friday morning. I was not there. I don't know exactly what was said. What I know is that Rowan retained a criminal defense lawyer that same afternoon, and that Philippa called my mother shortly after and told her that she had known nothing about any of it, that Rowan had handled all their finances, that she was devastated, that she was the real victim in this situation. My mother told me about this call later. She said it in a very neutral tone, the way she describes things she has not yet decided how to feel about. I said nothing. The business records were subpoenaed. Bright Shore was examined. The director listed on the incorporation documents was a former associate of Rowan's from a previous job. The man cooperated with investigators in exchange for leniency, from what Ms. Okwu was able to tell me later. Rowan was charged in June. Fraud over $5,000, the relevant section of the criminal code, along with breach of trust. The case moved due the Ontario court system over the following year, the way these things do, slowly and with a great deal of paperwork. My father hired a new accountant and a business manager. Colette held everything together in the meantime, as she always had. Philippa and Rowan separated in the fall. I don't know whose decision that was. I haven't asked. What I want to tell you about, actually, is not the legal proceedings. It's a conversation I had with my dad about 2 months after everything came out, on a Saturday in June. We were sitting on his back deck. He had his coffee. I had a beer because it was warm and I'd driven 4 hours. He was watching a squirrel dismantle his bird feeder with what appeared to be genuine admiration. He said, "And of nowhere, she hired someone to prove you were dishonest." "Yeah," I said. "And that person found out she was the dishonest one." "More or less." He was quiet for a moment. The squirrel got the feeder open. A shower of sunflower seeds rained down onto the deck. "That must have been a very bad day for her," he said, not with satisfaction, just as a fact. I thought about my sister, who is 10 years older than me, who I have known my entire life, who taught me how to braid my hair and how to play gin rummy, and who once drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to pick me up from a party when I was 17 because I had called her instead of my parents. "Yeah," I said. "It must have been." There is no clean ending to this. That's the thing about real life. It doesn't resolve the way stories are supposed to. My dad's business is still running, smaller now, with some structural changes that Ms. Okwu helped put in place. My mother has good days and hard days. My sister is living in a condo in Burlington, and we have spoken exactly twice since everything happened, once when she called me to say she was sorry, in a very brief and formal way, and once at Christmas, when we were both at my parents' house and we managed to sit in the same room for 4 hours without either of us saying anything that made things worse. I consider that a small victory. I still drive to Sudbury every other weekend. My dad and I still watch the Leafs lose. He still argues that Tim Hortons hasn't changed and I'm just being nostalgic for something that never existed. But some nights I think about Derek Haines. This stranger who was hired to expose me, who sat down with a set of financial records and came back with something no one expected. I think about how differently this could have gone. If he had just filed his report, I had nothing to hide, he would have found nothing and left it at that. If he had decided it wasn't his problem, he could have done that. A lot of people would have. Instead, he called Miss Okwu. He said he thought we should know. My father's business is still standing. His name is still on the door. His retirement is intact, or close to it, which is more than it might have been. I am still a school counselor in Kitchener. I still drive a used Subaru. My cat Gerald remains indifferent to all of this, which I respect. And the will. My dad's actual will, the one Philippa tried so hard to discredit, turns out to have been executed at a time when my father was in perfectly fine health, witnessed properly, filed with the solicitor, and about as legally airtight as a document can be. He knew what he was doing. He always did. I keep coming back to the squirrel. My dad watching it dismantle his bird feeder, seeds raining down everywhere, and him saying, not bitterly, not triumphantly, that must have been a very bad day for her. That's the image I return to when I try to make sense of everything that happened. Not the courtroom language, not the OPP investigation, not the certified letters from Ms. Okwu's office. Just my dad, his coffee going cold, watching a squirrel, saying something true. I used to think that doing the right thing would feel more obvious than it does, that there'd be some clear signal. What I learned is that integrity is mostly quiet. It's Colette picking up the phone on a Tuesday evening because she knew something was wrong and she thought I should know. It's Derek Haines filing a report he wasn't required to file because he couldn't in good conscience not. It's Ms. Okwu saying, don't touch anything, when every instinct I had was telling me to defend myself loudly and immediately. Doing the right thing, in my experience, looks a lot like doing nothing dramatic at all. And that's harder than it sounds. When Philippa started calling relatives, when I found out about the investigator, when my aunt asked me those careful, gentle questions, every part of me wanted to fight back the way I'd been attacked. Loudly. Publicly. I wanted to call everyone she called and tell my side. I wanted to confront her directly, repeatedly, until she acknowledged what she was doing. I didn't. Not because I'm particularly patient or virtuous, but because Miss Okwu told me not to, and I was scared enough to listen. Looking back, that fear probably saved everything. The restraint I managed in those months, holding still while someone actively tried to destroy my credibility. That cost me something real. I don't think people talk enough about what it takes to stay quiet when you know you're being lied about. It requires a specific kind of stubbornness, a decision made over and over that the truth is sufficient and doesn't need your help to eventually land where it should. My sister is someone I have known my entire life. She taught me things. She drove through a snowstorm to pick me up when I was 17 and too embarrassed to call our parents. I don't know how to hold that version of her alongside everything else, and I'm not sure I'm supposed to resolve that tension neatly. I think it just lives there, both things true at once. What I do know is that greed has a way of hollowing out the judgment of people who might otherwise be decent. Rowan didn't stumble into $190,000 in fraudulent invoices by accident. That required planning, patience, and a calculated bet that my father was too trusting to notice and too unwell to check. He was wrong about the second part, eventually. but only because other people chose at their own cost and inconvenience, to be honest. That's the thing I think about most. The whole story turned on a series of ordinary people deciding to tell the truth when they didn't have to. Colette. Derek. Ms. Oakwu. None of them were heroes in any dramatic sense. They just did what they said they would do and didn't look away from what they found. I'm still a school counselor. I still drive up to Sudbury every other weekend. My dad's name is still on the door of a business he built with his own hands over 30 years, and it's still standing. That's enough. Most days, that's more than enough.